The topic of our talk tonight is Obama and Netanyahu, no love lost. And it's kind of ironic. When we planned this conversation, we didn't really plan for it to come out on Valentine's Day, but it did. And it just adds another layer of irony. I don't have the best sources in the White House or in the Prime Minister's office, but I'm pretty sure that there were no Valentine's exchange today between Netanyahu and Obama, and there was no bouquet of red roses landed at the Prime Minister's office or in the White House. The fact that the relationship between Netanyahu and Obama is broken, probably broken beyond repair, isn't new. And there's more to it than just two personalities that don't get along together. We're talking about the leader of the free world and the leader of the Jewish state that have serious communication problems. And in the next few minutes, I'll just try to look at the roots of this disagreement, this fraught relationship between these two leaders, and try to figure out if things could have been done in another way, why they seem to get along so miserably, and more important, what does this mean to the future of the relationship between the two nations, not only between these two leaders. Feel free to ask questions as we go ahead, but I'll also try to keep it as short as possible so we'll have some more time for discussion once we're done with it. But I would want to start off with a little bit of a historic look, a recap of the relationship between Obama and Netanyahu, going back to 2008 and pretty much up to these last few months. So let's start with 2008. Obama's running for president. Netanyahu, by the way, is also running for prime minister of Israel at the same time. And one of the first points that I'd like to put my finger on is this visit of Obama, the candidate, to Israel. Before he was elected president, it was a very successful visit on all accounts. He touched on all the issues that Israelis care about. He met with the prime minister and the president. He visited Yad Vashem. He went to Sderot. He had a very meaningful visit to Sderot. He spoke at that overlook from where you can see the Gaza Strip and the rockets that are fired at the residents of Sderot. It was an emotional visit. And in his speeches there, he touched on all the issues that Israelis care about. He really gave the sense that his own commitment to the security, to the well-being of Israel, will be maintained if and when he becomes president. These same ideas that were later on coined as that phrase that we hear so much now about the unshakable, unbreakable relationship and bond between the United States and Israel. Now, that was important also for Israelis, because for Israelis, Obama was, to a certain extent, an unknown quantity. They know American politicians, but for many, even over here, Obama came from nowhere. They didn't know him. He was a junior senator from Illinois. He didn't have a lot of experience with the Jewish world, with the pro-Israel world. So this was a good way to get the Israelis and the Israeli leadership to know more about him. And I'd say that pretty much they liked what they saw there. Even though, of course, in the right-wing circles, there was always a tendency to prefer Republican candidates. So Obama goes back home, Bibi goes back to Jerusalem, and both of them go ahead to win their elections. Obama with a very large margin, Netanyahu just manages to get through somehow, but both of them take office pretty much at the same time. And this is where the relationship begins to be a little more problematic. And the next point in our timeline that we should look at is 2009, the Cairo speech. And this is probably the most important point in the relationship between Obama and Israel as he starts off his first term in office. Now, let's look at the background of it. Obama takes office after a very difficult 8 years in terms of the relationship of the United States with the Arab world. The image of the United States in the Arab world is rock bottom. After the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Arab world has the feeling that the United States has, in a sense, given up on them, that the United States, in its miscalculations of the way the Middle East is run, unleashed this terrible war between Sunnis and Shia and Kurds in Iraq, that it's messing up Afghanistan. They're looking at Guantanamo. They're looking at many issues that the Arab world doesn't like. And Obama, hi, come sit down. Obama gets into office and he understands that his first task is to somehow rebuild the relationship with the Arab world. And he decides to do it with this dramatic gesture. He flies to Cairo and he gives this historic speech to the Egyptian people, to the Arab world. And it was a historic speech, undoubtedly. His message basically was, look, the United States is a friend of the Arab world and of the Muslim world. We're not in war against Islam, we're in war against terror. We will fix the relationship. And it was an important message to give at the time. But Israelis looked at it at a different way. First of all, they listened very carefully, and what they heard there wasn't this overall message to the Arab world saying, we're going to open a new page in the relationship. They heard this one sentence there about the need to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the other one about the United States opposing or viewing the Israeli settlement policy as illegitimate. Nothing new about that. That's American policy forever. But it didn't sound right to Israeli ears. Of course, there were those also that pointed to the fact that Obama, when talking about Israel as a Jewish state, mentioned the Holocaust as a reason for the, or as the force driving driving to an independent modern Israel, whereas for most Israelis that would be one factor, but the bigger idea is that this is a result of Zionism, of the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland. So there was something about it that didn't sound right to Israelis and to Netanyahu, and mainly there was this optics of Obama flying all the way to Cairo and then not stopping in Jerusalem. It's only an hour away. It would make a big difference for Israelis if after delivering this address, this historic address to the Arab world, Obama would also stop by in Jerusalem and deliver an address to the Jewish world or to the Israelis. And he could say pretty much the same, but it would look different. But he never did that. He actually went on from there to Buchenwald, where he had a very emotional visit to the concentration camp. Some of the Obama advisors thought that that was a way of kind of reaching out to the Jewish world, but that was totally lost on the Israelis. They didn't see that way. They saw an American president who's starting off his presidency with this dramatic gesture to the Arab world, which was not coupled with any kind of reach out to the Israelis. And again, in Obama's mindset, that made perfect sense. The relationship with Israel was steady, was safe. There was no doubt that the US is Israel's #1 ally. There was no urgency in reaching out to the Israelis. The urgency was in resolving the relationship with the Arab and the Muslim world. But again, Israelis see this in a different way. And this lack of sensitivity, this kind of misunderstanding of the nuances of Israeli politics and Israeli mindset, this is something that we'll see further on as this relationship evolved. And to a certain extent, that is the reason that the relationship turned out to be what it is. So we're moving forward. Obama settles in office. He launches his own peace plan, as every US president pretty much does. He appoints George Mitchell as his special envoy to the Middle East, starts discussing with the Israelis a settlement freeze. And then on the first major visit, Joe Biden comes to Israel in 2010. And that turned out to be a huge fiasco. Come join us. Because as Vice President Biden prepares to leave his hotel to dinner hosted by Prime Minister Netanyahu and his wife, he learns that Israel just issued new building plans for an East Jerusalem Jewish neighborhood. And Biden, being Biden, totally flipped and let Netanyahu and the world know about it. And this visit, which was the first high-level visit of an Obama administration official in Israel, turned out to be a complete fiasco. Netanyahu later said that it wasn't really a building plan, it was just an announcement on another phase of a plan already approved in advance, but that really made no difference, first of all, because of it was seen as a new plan, and also because the Israeli governments do have a pattern of rolling out these settlement building plans any time an American official comes to Israel. And this dates back to the time when George Shultz was shuttling between Israel and the Arab countries. It happens all the time. So that really was part of that pattern. What evolved from there on was just an endless series of these slights and mishaps that really characterized this relationship between Netanyahu and Obama and built this narrative of mistrust between the two sides. Now, we can talk about it all night. Just to mention a few, there was that famous Netanyahu visit to the White House in which he was offended by the fact that he was brought in from the side gate and there was no photo, and they waited in the dining room for an hour until Obama joined them, and there was no official photo of the meeting. There was, speaking of photos, there was the famous phone call of Obama to Netanyahu, in which the White House released the official photo of Obama sitting with his shoes, with his feet on his desk in the Oval Office, and you kind of saw the soles of his shoes, and apparently in some cultures, that I never knew that existed, in some cultures that's considered offensive. And Netanyahu chose to take offense from that as well. So this relationship continues to deteriorate. By the end of 2010, this round of peace process has basically failed. Israel agreed to a temporary freeze of the settlement. That ends without anything coming out of it, and it's pretty much declared dead. And we fast forward to May of 2011. And then that's the next flashpoint, when President Obama decides to give his major speech on the Middle East, which was supposed to provide America's view on the Arab Spring. There's a lot of confusion about what's going on. It's clear already by then that Egypt isn't going in the right direction. There was still hope about Libya. The Syrian civil war is just starting, and Obama gives a major speech at the State Department addressing the new developments in the Middle East. And in this speech, Obama gives one sentence which says that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should be resolved based on the 1967 borders with agreed-upon land swaps. Now, for those of you following it, it's not a huge shock. This is language that appears everywhere since the 2000 Camp David Accords. But for Netanyahu, this was a call for arms, because in his mind, Obama was stating the outcome, or at least the territorial outcome of negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians before these negotiations even took place. Basically, he's saying, you know, you can talk to the Palestinians, but we already know that you have to give up this land. And that was seen as unacceptable to Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, being Netanyahu, let the world know about it. 2 days later, he arrives at the White House, sitting in the Oval Office next to President Obama with the reporters around them. I was one of them. He gave what is known as the Oval Office lecture, in which instead of just saying some nice things to your host, and I'm happy to be here, he lectured for many minutes Obama on the history of the Jewish people and the concerns and their security issues and their connection to the historical homeland. And Obama was furious, and his advisors were furious, and that meeting didn't end so well either. Now, at the same time, we should mention that while this personal relationship between the two leaders is unraveling, the two states are actually getting along not bad. The United States has done a few significant things. Military and intelligence cooperation between the United States and Israel reached new levels of understanding that never existed before. The UN in 2000, the United States in 2012 blocked an attempt by the Palestinians to reach statehood unilaterally through the United Nations, which was a very big deal for the Israelis, and the United States negotiated that out. So we see at the same time these two things are happening. The personal relationship is going down the drain, but the relationship between the two countries is pretty much functional. Now we can add another thing. We're moving forward. We're now, I guess it was towards the end of 2011 in November. There was a famous open mic incident. There was this international event. The mics were still open, even though the leaders thought they were off. And Obama and Sarkozy, who was the French president at the time, were caught discussing Bibi Netanyahu. And Sarkozy said, the guy is such a liar, to which Obama responded, well, I have to deal with him every day. That didn't add to the relationship as well. And we move forward, so we get closer to the 2012 elections, and there's another hotspot there because this perception is created that Bibi Netanyahu and his close allies are playing politics with the United States, that they're somehow supporting Mitt Romney in his run against Obama. And that materializes when Romney decides to visit Israel and is welcomed by Netanyahu. Of course, Netanyahu didn't officially endorse him, but for the Obama administration, that was seen as kind of a slap in the face. You know, we're before elections now. You shouldn't be doing something like that. It's clear that Romney will use this visit for political gains. So that was seen again as some kind of an attempt by Netanyahu to meddle with American politics. However, obviously it didn't work. Obama got reelected. And in March of 2013, he decides to visit Israel for the first time in his presidency. It was long awaited. There was a lot of talk, why didn't he visit earlier? He didn't. The fact of the matter is that some presidents did, some presidents didn't. But in March of 2013, he pays a visit to Israel. It's actually a very successful visit. He has good meetings with Netanyahu. He speaks to the Israeli public. He's received very warmly. There is a sense that we're opening a new page in the relationship. But of course, it didn't work. John Kerry takes over as Secretary of State. He launches his own peace process instead of Mitchell as the Middle East envoy. We have now Martin Indyk as the Middle East envoy. But you pretty much know how this ends. They talk, they pressure all the sides. Eventually, it takes a year, it takes 2 years, but they come back and they say, we could not reach a solution. But what happens at every round of this relationship is that the American negotiators come back with a very strong feeling that even though the Palestinians were less than cooperative, the Israelis were even worse or just as bad. And that's the impression also that Kerry gets and conveys to President Obama at the time. And now we actually fast forward to the most important moment, which is the negotiations around the Iran deal. Now, throughout all these years, Netanyahu is sending one clear message to the Obama administration. And that is, our main goal is to resolve the Iranian issue. Iran having a nuclear weapon is an existential threat on Israel. They'll get the bomb, they might nuke Israel. You have to do everything you can to resolve that. And as we move forward, the United States shifts from a mode of no negotiations with Iran to actually starting to talk to them, initially conducting secret talks, and later moving on to the P5+1 negotiations that we saw. Now, Israel was not informed about the secret track that the Obama administration was holding with Iran initially. And, you know, you could probably guess that since both countries are spying after each other, Israelis probably knew that American negotiators are meeting with Iranians, but still, Israel wasn't informed, and Netanyahu was furious about it. He felt that Obama is going behind his back on the most important issue that Israel cares about. And later on, when these negotiations became public and it was clear what the deal is shaping out to be, Netanyahu went for the battle of his life against Obama and against the Iranian deal, which of course culminated in his address to the joint session of Congress in March last year. Just to refresh your memory, he did not ask or inform the White House about it. He was invited by then Speaker John Boehner. He decided to accept the invitation. The White House was furious. It was only a few weeks before the elections in Israel. Obama refused to meet Bibi Netanyahu while he was in Washington. Many of the Democratic members of Congress boycotted the meeting, but Bibi Netanyahu went ahead with it anyways, and basically told members of the US Congress that your president is going to come up with a deal soon for your approval, vote against it, it's a bad deal. But that didn't help much for the relationship between the two leaders. But this was basically the watershed moment. This was the moment after which it was clear that nothing will come out of this relationship between the two leaders, that Netanyahu and Obama are so far apart that this is really beyond repair. Of course, as we know, the Iran nuclear deal passed Congress, or it didn't even come to a vote eventually. It took effect recently. So far, I think Israelis are okay with it, or at least it became an issue that Israelis aren't discussing that much. And if you want to really get up to speed to what's going on now there's a new dispute going on, and that's over the new aid package that the U.S. has promised Israel. You know that the United States provides Israel with a military aid worth something around $3.1 billion a year, plus all kind of extras that bring it up to around $4 billion. This is a 10-year aid program that will end in 2017, and negotiations are underway now for a new 10-year program. And there is this expectation in Israel that the new aid program will be much larger than the current one. The Obama administration is offering reportedly something like another $400 million a year beyond the 3.1 and the extras. And that's the current dispute between the two governments. But you could argue that that's not a personal matter. That's an argument or a negotiation between two countries. That's not necessarily a problem. Although, had there been normal relationship between the two leaders, it's probably something that they could resolve in a phone call, or it's something that at least they could talk about in a more civil way, but that doesn't exist, unfortunately. So I'd like to spend a few minutes on just discussing why this whole thing happened. Is it a problem with the personality of the two leaders? Is it their ideology? Is it just a combination of mistakes and coincidences? I think it's probably all of the above. One reason is that we do have to acknowledge that Obama and Netanyahu come from very different worldviews, generations, and backgrounds. Bibi is 66, Obama is 54. Bibi grew up in a house of a staunch, conservative, Israeli prominent thinker who basically taught his son that every day the sun rises and a new threat comes with it to the Jewish people. And Bibi Netanyahu really believes that his role in this world is to defend the Jewish people and Israel from all those wishing to destroy it, and they exist. And of course, President Obama comes from a very different background. His formative years were passed in liberal circles. Where Netanyahu sees concern and risk, he sees hope and change. We know all about that. So there is this sense that they really don't share their basic worldview. Not to mention the fact that Obama, because of his background, also tends to, his basic predisposition would be more of empathy to the underdogs. And for the past, pretty much for the past 10, 20, 30 years, Israel is no longer the underdog in the Middle East. Also, there were issues of communication and understanding between them. Bibi Netanyahu's claim to fame is that he's Mr. America. He knows everything about America. He grew up here. He had a business here. Was an ambassador here. He understands Americans, and that's what he was telling Israelis all these years. You know, I'm the one who knows how to deal with America. He had a great relationship with Newt Gingrich, when Gingrich was Speaker of the House. They both together, they kind of worked around President Clinton at the time. He had very close ties with neoconservative circles here. He was considered the expert for America. Of course, he has flawless English. So he was seen as the guy who can talk to Americans. And Obama, on the other hand, kind of thought that he understands, in a certain way, American Jews and, by extension, Israelis. But again, it was a very different kind of people than the real Israelis and American Jews. He has close ties with the liberal Jews from Chicago, but they probably don't represent the broader pro-Israel community and definitely don't represent the right-wing school of thought in Israel. So you have here Mr. America who's communicating with an America that no longer exists, and an American president who knows a Jewish community and knows an Israel that also is no longer the dominant power over there. And these different backgrounds make it very difficult for them to communicate in a constructive way. Now, beyond that, there's also the question of how they view each other. And this is probably a product of the relationship as it went forward. But in Bibi's eyes and in the eyes of his advisors, Obama is naive. Obama is seen as an appeaser. He'll do anything to appease the Arab world. He views the Palestinians as oppressed. He's driven by this need to mend fences with the world to justify the fact that he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and now he has to prove that he's really a peacemaker. And most important, Netanyahu, and again, by extension, Israelis, view Obama as weak. Now, Obama, on the other hand, he sees Netanyahu as an obstructionist. He thinks that Netanyahu is being dishonest with him and with America, that he's a hardliner in sheep's clothing, that he in a sense, tries to play this double game of on the one hand, supporting a two-state solution, but in practice not doing anything to promote that. He also suspects Bibi Netanyahu of playing politics in terms of the internal politics of the United States. So these diverging views really don't give us any chance for a very productive relationship between the two. Now, having said that, there are also these major mistakes that both sides have made. If you ruin the relationship with Israel's most important allies, you'll pay a price in terms of the Israeli politics. That's what happened to Yitzhak Shamir. And Obama kind of thought somewhere in the back of his mind that, you know, eventually Bibi Netanyahu will understand that he can't win re-elections when he's leading the relationship with the United States into this huge disaster. But it turned out that no, that wasn't the case. In fact, Netanyahu turned his fraught relationship with Obama into a political asset and used it to win the next elections and to establish himself as one of the strongest leaders politically in Israel. So that was another miscalculation which the Obama administration could probably figure out if they would follow closely the way the Israeli public opinion has shifted since the days of Yitzhak Shamir in the 1990s. It's also worth noting that this idea of pressuring Israel on the Palestinian issue is needed, but it was probably timed in a very poor way. Basically, the Obama administration started off by telling Israel and the Netanyahu government, you need to freeze settlements, which is a big deal in terms of internal politics in Israel. It's not a big deal in terms of living on the ground. You have 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, you'll have another 100 or more or less, that doesn't make a difference. It makes a difference politically. And they started off by pressuring Israel, but it was premature because there was no peace process going on. The Palestinians weren't giving anything. There was no movement. Eventually, they pressured Israel for a gesture that wasn't worth anything, and just caused unneeded and unnecessary tension in this relationship. Having said all these things that Obama did wrong, Bibi Netanyahu also made his own mistakes, of course. And the first one, in my opinion, is that Netanyahu never understood that he needs to choose his battles. If Netanyahu is telling the United States and the world, listen, Iran is the existential threat. This is what we're facing. This is the big issue. Iran will get a nuclear bomb and Israel will no longer exist. This is basically what he was saying. If that's the case, you need the United States on your side. And in order to have the United States on your side, you need to make certain concessions in terms of the negotiations with the Palestinians. Instead of that, he chose to fight tooth and nail on the Palestinian issue. And by the time he got around to his major battle on the Iranian agreement, his relationship with Obama was already destroyed, and he had no leverage. He lost the Democrats already by then as allies, and he had no way of actually gaining ground in this battle that was way more important than the question of whether you freeze settlements for 10 months or for 20 months. The other thing, of course, is playing politics. Now, Americans, especially Democrats, have suspected Netanyahu for years of trying to play politics in the United States. They remember what he did to Clinton. They know about his close ties with the Republicans. They know that some Republicans share a major donor with him, and that major donor may want him to do some things for that. So he already entered this relationship with this question mark over him of whether he is really honest in his relationship or whether he's trying to promote some kind of Republican agenda. And instead of avoiding that, he stepped right into it by inviting Romney, by giving the speech in Congress, by doing all these things that were interpreted as pure politics. So definitely, and these are just examples of the mistakes behind this. Adding to that, questionable nominations. I mean, you can't nominate to the ambassador in the United States a person who was personally involved in inviting Mitt Romney to Israel and then expect the administration to see that as a positive move. All these things together brought us to where we have today. Just one point to the credit of these two leaders, they were dealing with an unprecedented situation in the Middle East, namely the Arab Spring that started 5 years ago. There's no textbook for that, and really both of them were kind of figuring out their way as they went. Now, through the forum, Netanyahu, when he saw changes in the region, he interpreted them as dangerous to Israel. Mubarak is falling in Egypt, concern for Israel. Gaddafi is falling in Libya, concern for Israel. Civil war in Syria, concern for Israel. Obama, on the other hand, again, just because that's the way he is, he saw hope all over. He saw hope in Libya and hope in Egypt and in Yemen and in Syria. Now, both of them, of course, were wrong about this whole thing. But to their credit, again, we should know that this is a situation that no one ever predicted and no one ever saw before. And the fact that it did introduce this additional layer of tension to the relationship is kind of understandable. A word about the Iran deal. Why was this huge fight about the Iran deal? Part of it goes back to this perception that we spoke about earlier that Israelis have of Obama as being weak. Israelis believe that had Obama been stronger, he'd negotiate a better deal, or he'd be more forceful with the military option, or he'd have a real military option. Because even though Obama said all the time, all options are on the table, meaning we will use military force against Iran if needed, Israelis never believed him. Israelis thought that he's some kind of peacenik who will never move a tank or never move a jet fighter, even if the Iranians are building a nuclear bomb. So there's this perception issue, but there's also a basic misunderstanding about what the deal was. And as we moved into 2015 and these negotiations became public, it was clear that there was no way to resolve this because Israel wanted one kind of a deal, which meant zero enrichment, which meant Iran will never have the ability to do anything nuclear. And that wasn't the starting point of the Obama administration or of the entire world that negotiated it. Their starting point was we resolve the nuclear military aspects of it. We put in force all these safeguards. We have monitoring. And then just like every other country, Iran will be allowed to have a civilian nuclear program. Now, this dispute played out throughout the months until the signing of the agreement. And there was basically no way to resolve it because we were talking of two different kinds of agreements. The other thing is, and that's something that Netanyahu introduced later on in the negotiations, is that it's not only about the nuclear issue. Okay, so you discuss the nuclear issue, but what about Iran getting money and buying arms? And what about them supporting Hamas and Hezbollah? And what about their meddling in Syria and in Yemen? And what about anti-Semitism? And what about human rights? To which, again, the Obama administration said, you were talking about an existential threat. The existential threat was nuclear weapons, and we dealt with that. Will they shoot rockets through Hezbollah and Israel? Maybe, but you can deal with that. That's not part of the deal. So the differences were so big to start with that there was probably no way to reconcile what Israel saw as a good deal and what the US saw as a good deal. But because of everything that happened before, this turned into a huge personal fight that really destroyed the trust between the two leaders. So the last point I wanted to talk about before we open it up to you is what does it mean for the future? What does it mean, first of all, is this just a personal fight between two leaders who can't get along for because of so many reasons? Or does this mean something for the nations? So on a certain level, there's no impact. Military relationship, as I mentioned, is as good as it's ever been. So good that the Obama administration sold Israel bombs that George Bush wouldn't sell Israel. Intelligence cooperation is everything Israel could have ever hoped for. Trade, diplomatic tie. America defended Israel in the UN numerous times, even when it got in trouble with the Europeans in the UN, in the International Criminal Court. Everything is working great in that sense. And that has to do also with the fact that US-Israeli ties really go beyond the personality of that certain person that sits in the Prime Minister's office in Jerusalem or in the White House in Washington. They really build on the fact that the American public opinion is very supportive of Israel, whether it has to do with this shared idea of democracy or the only democracy in the Middle East, whether it has to do with the Judeo-Christian values, as some seem to say, whether it has to do with this very effective pro-Israel lobbying system that's in place. Whatever the reason, the fact of the matter is that the relationship is strong, way beyond the power of any two leaders to ruin it. However, there can be a negative impact in the long term. Part of it, first of all, has to do with this lack of trust between the two leaders. There's a reason the Obama administration didn't tell Bibi Netanyahu they were holding secret negotiations with Iranians, right? Because by then, Obama didn't trust Bibi. And there's a reason that both sides are managing their own foreign policy without sharing it with the other side. It's because there's this lack of trust. More important, because this partisan issue was introduced, because there's this perception there that under Obama and Netanyahu, Israel has become a partisan issue, that to a certain extent, being pro-Israel is turning into a Republican issue. That is something that's really dangerous in the long run. Because, as everyone knows, you have a Republican president, you have a Democratic president, you have a Republican majority in Congress, you have a Democratic majority in Congress. These shift. And the only way to maintain a strong US-Israel relationship is by making sure that you work with both sides. Now, if because of this personal relationship and because of these bad 7 or 8 years between the two leaders, Israel will become a partisan issue, will become one of those issues like abortions or global warming. That's a Republican issue, it's an issue on the Republican agenda. That will be very harmful for Israel because that will make things much more difficult in the years that Republicans aren't in power. So, Obama administration will come to an end soon. Bibi Netanyahu's administration will also maybe end, maybe not in a few years. And I guess the question I'll leave you with is what happens after that? Can you overcome these personal feelings to rebuild the relationship? Or is this the beginning of a more difficult period? And really, that we'll have to wait and see, but I'll be happy now to take any questions or to hear comments. Sure. I think that's a good point. I mean, basically, there are different ways of evaluating it. And one of them is internal politics. I mean, will they go down as leaders who delivered for their own voters? And in that sense, both of them will feel pretty good about it, especially Netanyahu, who managed to get reelected with a large majority and established himself as a strong leader who stood up to President Obama, even though, of course, the Iran deal did pass, he didn't really achieve anything. But in that sense, and it does sound a little cynical, but it's true, in that sense, they don't view it as mistakes. At the same time, leaders also look at history, and if history will judge their terms in office as problematic, at least from this one aspect of the relationship between the two countries, which is more important for Israel, of course, than it is for the United States, then I think they would have to agree that mistakes have been done. Sure. On a certain level, it doesn't make sense, but it does on another level, because there's also a question of expectation. Now, even, and that's why I spent some time trying to explain how good the relationship is, even though the two leaders don't get along together. Because I think Saudi Arabia and China and any other country and Russia would really, if you'd offer them the relationship that Israel has right now with the United States, they'd take it with both their hands. They'd be happy for it. The thing with Israel is, and that's going back to the Condi Rice example, Israel expects more. There's an expectation on both sides for a stronger relationship, which is not only practical but also emotional. Because on the practical level, really, there is no problem. The United States delivered an excellent deal, nuclear deal, that Israel is the main beneficiary of. Now, you can argue it's not exactly the deal that Israel wanted, but Israel told the world this is an existential threat. This existential threat doesn't exist anymore. The uranium was actually shipped out of Iran in the last few months. That's something that's unthinkable if you think a year or two ago. So on the ground, the relationship is still good. There's this added layer that has to do with the fact that these allies are so close, that Israel is so threatened, that there is a Jewish community and a political constituency over here that care deeply about these things. That's why sometimes it seems that the United States is so critical of Israel, but not so critical of other allies, but it's a different level of a relationship. Yes, please. To a certain extent, keep in mind that Netanyahu just came off a very successful re-election less than a year ago, or exactly a year ago, and he's really establishing himself as one of the strongest leaders in Israeli history. But yeah, to a certain extent, he doesn't understand it also because of the way that the political system operates in Israel, which is, it's a parliamentary system, but it's also a winner takes it all. And once you form your coalition, basically you surround yourself with members of your own party and like-minded parties. The opposition has very little input, so it's very difficult to penetrate this bubble that an Israeli leader surrounds himself in. Yes, please. I think that's a good point. It goes beyond the discussion of Obama and Netanyahu, but it does go to the point of how Israel is perceived in the world, and true in Europe. The situation in Europe is way more difficult than it is in the United States, because basically there is this ongoing conversation of whose fault is it that there is no peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Frankly, it's everyone's fault. And apparently it's more difficult to achieve an agreement than anyone had in mind ever. And that's why these smart people go out there and try to negotiate and eventually don't reach it. However, within this entire complex of this very complicated issue, the settlement issue does kind of stand out as something that doesn't make sense. And that's why Europeans are mad about it, and that's why the American administrations keep on talking about it, because it's one thing not to reach an agreement with the Palestinians about the details of a peace accord, and it's one thing to be suspicious and to be concerned when you know that there'll be a Palestinian state so close to your borders. But at the same time, it's very difficult to justify settlement expansion, and that's why that became a hot button topic. Yes, please. Well, I think at least it was a tactical mistake to raise this issue so early in the negotiations. Now, it's clear, obviously, the Palestinians want Israel to freeze the settlements and to get out of there. But since it wasn't a clear demand of the Palestinians in order to get back to the negotiations, it's kind of hard to understand why Obama jumped the gun on that. Why was it so important for him to set that as the precondition for starting negotiations? And I think that goes back to some of the misunderstandings he had about Israel and about the negotiations. One of them also has to do with this perception, and when you talk to Obama administration people, they keep going back to this idea that the Israeli public doesn't support the settlements. And they look at public opinion polls. It's all true. Israeli public won't go to war for the settlements, doesn't support the idea of settlements. That's a small minority. But still, at the same time, you also have to understand that the Israeli public does care about national pride, does care about getting a good deal. And when it's seen as if they're pressured into something that's less than a good deal, or that they're under more pressure than the other side, they'll react negatively to that. And that's something that Obama missed there, I think. Well, I think for Netanyahu, really, according to people that write about him and know him better than I do, the Iran deal was a do or die. What was the moment that supposedly Netanyahu was preparing for his entire life. That was his historic mission. As the son of Professor Ben Zion Netanyahu, as the one who grew up with all this concept of eternal threats to the Jewish people, he had to make this his one cause and to fight as much as he could for it. And that was his moment, and that's why he ignored anything else regarding it. Had he not gone to Congress and given that speech and totally broken his relationship with the Democrats, he would very likely have more Democratic allies when it actually came to the question of the vote on the deal. But by the time you reached the deal, Democrats weren't willing to hear from Netanyahu at all. That was definitely a wrong tactic on his behalf. Yes, please. That's a good point. I think what it boils down to is a question of trust. I mean, they don't have to become best of friends. Sometimes it happens, you know. Arik Sharon, for some reason, had this great relationship with George Bush. Go figure, they come from two different worlds, but for some reason there was some click there. They got along together. Rabin got along together great with Clinton. But it doesn't mean much beyond that. Yeah, they liked each other, but that's not the issue. The main issue is how do you maintain trust? And to do that, it's not only about getting to know each other or being nice to each other. It's basically about convincing the other side that you're listening to them, that you're honest with them, that you're not going behind their back, and that when you have differences, you discuss them and negotiate them in an open way. And that those are basic leadership skills that you probably expect your leaders to have in any kind of negotiation that they have with foreign leaders or with the members of Congress or with any kind of domestic group as well. So I think that goes to the core of it. They don't have to be good friends. And really, I find it hard to imagine how Netanyahu and Obama could have ever become good friends. They come from different worlds. They're different kinds of people. They like different things. But they could have built a respectful, honest relationship based on trust, even though they had disagreements between them, and frankly, both of them blew it. Basically, it's not America had a few nuclear deals. You know, we forget the fact that there was a nuclear deal with Libya. Libya dismantled its nuclear program and shipped it to the United States. So you have all kind of models here. And it's a very different deal than the North Korean deal, which obviously didn't work. There were nuclear negotiations. There were two deals with North Korea. Eventually, it defied these deals. It broke them, and it went forward with a nuclear program. Why is this one different? It's different, first of all, because you have a very elaborate system of verifying that they're not breaking out in order to produce nuclear weapons, which is something that you didn't have with North Korea. It's based on, first of all, the idea that they're shipping out their highly enriched uranium. They're physically dismantling their plutonium reactors, so both avenues are closed in that way. You have control over the whole chain of production of fissile materials, so they can't reach it in any way, and you have inspectors on the ground. Now, all this together should verify should give you a very good, should assure you at a very high level that Iran cannot break out and use its civil energy program to produce a nuclear bomb. It's way more effective than we had before. Now, the side deal you're talking about basically has to do with the inspection, and that was an issue here during the debate over the approval of the nuclear deal. Basically, this isn't an agreement between the United States and Iran. It's an agreement between the P5+1 and Iran, and the body in charge of enforcing the inspections is the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. And IAEA, as a matter of the way it conducts business, signs its own agreements with the other side. That's what was referred in Congress as the secret deal. It's not a secret, it's just the way the IAEA does its business. The United States is part of the IAEA, as are all other nations that are signed on this treaty, and they accept that there's nothing new about that. Now, the question was, how do they inspect suspected sites? The claim against that was basically that the agreement relates to the sites that we know about, but what happens if tomorrow morning the Iranians dig a new hole in the ground and start building a nuclear bomb there? What do you do about that? And the concern was that this agreement gives Iran a time period of 21 days, I think it was, 14, 21, I think it was 21 days, before inspectors can actually go into the place. And the assurance that was given was that A, during these 21 days, the place is still monitored from the outside, and B, there is no practical way, or I'm not a nuclear scientist, but apparently you cannot hide nuclear residue in 21 days. It's not something that, as some people say, you can just flush down the toilet and it's gone by the time they get there. So that's supposed to resolve these issues. Again, now, we should always keep in mind that nuclear negotiations are the nuclear agreement is a product of negotiation. You have two sides there. And this isn't the 100% perfect deal that America wanted, because it's a product of negotiations. It seems to me personally that it's a pretty good deal. I think there are those in Israel who also agree that it's a pretty good deal, even some important people in the Israeli security establishment. It's definitely not the dream deal that Israel wanted, which was something that was unachievable to start with, which basically meant Iran, the whole entire nation of Iran, will never touch anything nuclear ever, ever, ever. And even then, we won't give them back the money that's frozen here because they give aid to Hamas and Hezbollah. That deal was never in the cards. So you have to ask yourself if the deal that was achieved is good enough. Thank you all. Good night. Thanks.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.